Hi again, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the online study of the Book of Ruth. I'm so glad you joined us to go through this wonderful book, and I hope that the ladies have been enjoying the ladies' portion of the women's study. It is such a wonderful book, all about the redemption of God's people, and it really is an Old Testament marker, a prophetic look forward at Jesus, that he is the redeemer of his people, and God is even back in the Old Testament. We looked last week about, in the first two parts of the study, at how Elimelech, my God is king, and Naomi, pleasing, go off the rails, how they get themselves in trouble. They walk away from God. The book doesn't exactly say how they get there, but if you remember, the pattern of the study is such that it's in the middle of the book of Judges, a time where each person does what is right in their own eyes. And we have a clear example of that in Elimelech and Naomi. They are Jews meant to live in the promised land, meant to live with God and live off that land and what he provides for them. But because of the practices of the people at that point, they're engaged in a cycle that defines the book of Judges. It's after Joshua, where Joshua is an example of people following the Lord, going into the promised land and grabbing on to all that God has for us. After that, they fall off and they start going up and down, where Joshua dies and the people start petering out. They are following a great leader, but once that great leader is out of the way, they follow after whatever seems right to them. And you get really strange results when people who are supposed to be godly just leave it up to themselves to define what is good and what should be done. Elimelech and Naomi are dealing with a challenge in their life. They know that they are God's people. They know that they're, at least them or perhaps their parents, are set out to follow God just based on the names. My God is king and pleasing to God. But once a famine hits, there's trouble. The circumstances around them are challenging. And since it's the book of Judges, it would be a challenge as a result of the nation's, and likely their unfaithfulness. God, once the people petered out after a good leader, God would allow challenges to come into the land to bring them back to him, so that they repent and turn back to him. He would send judges to save them and to lead the nation against their enemies and to redeem the nation. But in the midst of that, there's the challenge, there's a famine in the land, and Elimelech and Naomi, rather than stay and turn back to God, look at Moab. If you remember from last week, Moab is the example of compromise. It is called the wash basin or toilet bowl of the world. At that point, God is not pleased with Moab because it comes out of Lot's unholy unholy dalliance with his daughters. His daughters are not trusting in God to provide them husbands, so they get their father drunk, and Moab and Ammon are born from there. So from the beginning, it's been all about compromise. It's been all about not trusting God, and this is where Elimelech and his wife flee during a time of famine. They don't trust God, so they go to a country that is all about not trusting God. It's kind of amusing in that way. And what happens when they get there is Elimelech dies, and then rather than have his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, learn from that and flee back to Israel, back to the land of God, back to the promised land, they stay and marry Ruth and Orpah, two Moabite women. They are choosing even worse. God has sent them a message and they just ignore it. they stay for another 10 years after that point, and they're doing exactly what they feel is right in their own eyes at that point. They then die, and it leaves Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, in terrible straits. In the ancient world, being a widow, there was nothing worse than being a widow for a respectable person. There was no real jobs for women back then. There was no Social Security or disability or anything like that. Once you lost your source of income, then they would often wind up either begging on the streets or turning to prostitution. So the only way around that was to turn to your family. And in this case, Naomi has left her family back in Israel, and her sons are dead, and Ruth and Orpah have married foreigners. They've turned away from their family. So they are desperate. They've got nothing to work with. They have no money, they have no prospects, they have no family in Moab, in a land that is dedicated to false gods. They've departed from God's plan, and they're feeling the results of it. If you remember, Israel is the land of milk and honey, and they start off in Bethlehem. The name of Bethlehem is House of Bread. And now they're in Moab, which is all about compromise and leaving God, and they're desperate. And to God's everlasting grace and mercy, as a testimony to that, when they're there, somehow God gets to them the word that there's bread, there's food in Israel. Return to me. It's a wonderful picture of God's grace and God's mercy on people, that even though they've gotten themselves in this predicament, even though God warned them and God told them and they're breaking God's rules to get where they are, God still sends messages of grace. Isn't that so true in our lives? We get ourselves in a predicament. We get ourselves in trouble. We run away from God. We make bad decisions, and then we reinforce bad decisions. But God keeps sending messages of grace. Return to me. I know you're empty. I know you're desperate. I know you're struggling. But there's food in the land. I will fulfill you. I will fill your belly and fill your heart. I will take care of you. Just return to me. So, in verse 6 of the passage, it says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah." Good start, right? They set out and return, all three of them. Ruth and Orpah, as the women in the relationship, would have taken on Mahlon and Chilion's religion. They would have lived in their household, at least outwardly following God. So they cannot fellowship with the Jewish people because they're foreigners, but they can live under God in that household. And with the death of their husbands, they mean to set out with Naomi back to Israel, and at least participate in the goodness, benefit from what God has given them. But there's a problem. Verse 8 says, "And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go return each to your mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." It's a strange thing that's going on here. It's made even clearer about what is Naomi's intention if you look down further in the passage, when in verse 12 she says, "Turn back, my daughters, why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of God has gone out against me. It says, to make it even clearer, in verse 15, Naomi says, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Naomi is a Israelite. She's a follower of Jehovah, the Most High God, the only true God. And do we see what she's doing here? Because her circumstance has gotten to be really terrible, and it truly is terrible. No one is underselling the fact that she's lost her husband and her sons. But because of that, she turns bitter, she turns angry, she turns against God and doesn't understand his goodness. And it has an effect. Her two daughters set out to follow her, daughters-in-law, set out to follow her back into the promised land where they will fall under the mercy and the grace of God. They will be among God's people. But Naomi doesn't trust God. Because of the pain she's experienced, she has the heartache. She doesn't trust that God is going to deal mercifully with her or with her daughters-in-law. And when she goes through, would you wait for them? Can I have a husband now? She's talking about the practice, the requirement in the families that if one brother in a family has a wife and he dies, the next brother is required to marry that wife and have an heir through that wife to have that brother's name carried on. Naomi is not being unreasonable here. She thinks that she's older. Mahlon and Chilion were adults, so there's got to be 20, 30 years, and they have to be either in their 20s, 30s, something around there. And the next child, even if she had one, you're going to have to wait 15, 20 years to marry that child with the hope of having an heir. So she looks and she thinks logically, Ruth, Orpah, there's nothing here for you. Logically, with my eyes, I can't help you. I can't redeem you. There's no way that I can lead you back to what you had before. Logically, you should not follow God. But that's based on her eyes. It's not based on God's goodness. She has forgotten the fact that God is good and God is a redeemer and God is going to deal justly with his people. She also seems to forget that as one of the two who have gotten herself into this trouble, she is forgetting the source of the problem, which is unfaithfulness to God. It's not that God will not provide. It's not that God cannot provide a way out of this. It's simply that she has chosen and her husband chose to turn away from God in struggles, to turn away from him in the time where sinfulness has brought consequences. That is why they have problems. It's not because God cannot fix whatever is going on in their lives, the lack of food, the lack of husbands, the lack of a place to live. Those logistics, God can take care of those in a second. So she's not seeing the source of the problem, which is sin and disobedience. She's just trying to figure out how this will work. She can't see a way out. So what does she tell her daughters-in-law? Return to the houses of your parents. Return to your people and to your gods. It's a terrible thing to say. And what's more, it says in verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Back in verse 9 and 10, it says, so she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. And then 14, Orpah kissed her mother, but Ruth clung to her. There's the two daughters who are intent on going back with Naomi to the promised land, to God's people. And one of them, hearing Naomi's discouragement, hearing her good intention direction, listens and goes back to her gods and to her people. She goes back to being a worshiper of false gods. What happens to Orpah in her life? If she goes back to her gods and her people and gets married, and even if she has food, even if she has clothing, even if she has a husband and kids, she's not right with God, and she's going to have to deal with God on Judgment Day. Naomi has put circumstances and logistics and comfort, abundance of physical things above a relationship with God, and she, because of her bitterness and her pain, has caused a little one to go astray. It's terrible. Sure, Orpah has responsibility. She has a responsibility to be like Ruth and pursue God and keep going. But it doesn't help when you're told by someone you love, no, turn away. No, turn away. This is too hard. You need to go and take care of yourself in the house of your parents. You know, I think about this and thinking about our kids, my kids, in this world that we're living in. This generation is challenging enough to be a Christian. I look forward and look at the next generation and the generation after that as my children are growing up in the next 30 years, 60 years, being a Christian. And sometimes it makes me fearful for them in my weakness, in my fleshliness, and just when I want to maneuver things for my kids and I don't trust God. I want to say, just like this, you know, take care of yourself, do this, don't follow God so boldly, because in 10 years we don't know where we're going to be. In 20 years, in 50 years, when I'm not here and you're on your own, there's going to be opposition. It's getting worse each year as we go on. One logic says, wouldn't it be easier just to turn away? There's food there, there's ease there, there's no persecution if you're just going along with the crowd. But that's not following God. And the eternity that comes after this life is way more important. The fact that I don't see the way that things are going to get better, that I don't understand when the revival is going to come, that I don't understand how my children in 50 years are going to be standing and proclaiming Jesus Christ regardless of what goes on. The fact that gives me a fear as the earthly dad doesn't mean that it's wrong. I know in my heart, when I think about it, when I understand how much Jesus loves me and loves them and will take care of them, I know, but there's still that bits of fear. I think that's what Naomi's doing here. She loves Ruth and Orpah. She doesn't mean bad for them. Her intention is not to hurt Orpah. It's not to send her to hell, but her walking by sight, her worldliness, her bitterness has warped her view. And as a result, she's taken her eyes off of Jesus and just has it squarely fixed on her pain in the world. And there's terrible consequences. It's the same for us. If we have our eyes on Jesus, then the world makes sense. Then walking after him makes sense. Then teaching others to come with us makes sense. But if we have our eyes on the world, then it's a challenge. And Christianity doesn't make sense in the world. It's foolishness to the world. The more we look at the world, the more Christianity is going to feel like foolishness, and the more discouraging it'll be, and the more that we will feel bitter, and it'll trickle down to our children and to the people we're discipling and to our workplace. Follow Jesus, follow him boldly, and that won't be a problem. we have the good response from Ruth. And in this, we just covered as a church the parable of the sower. And we had the shallow soil where the seed, the Word of God, makes some headway but doesn't get really to the heart, is the point Jesus is making. And then you have the soft, the deep soil where the Word of God has really made way and changed the heart of the person. And you really see this with Ruth and Orpah, because Orpah clings to Naomi for a short time, but then the words of discouragement turn her away. She turns away from following God, even though she has emotion, even though it hurts her. She wants to follow God to some extent, but with discouragement she turns away and she goes back to her people and to her gods. But not Ruth. And says, and she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge, and your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. I think a little hint there is there in the verse, at the end of verse 17. Because Ruth says, your God will be my God. And it's a bit equivocal. You don't know what she believes there. But then she says, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Ruth appears to understand that she is under the judgment of God. She's under the sovereignty of God, the hand of God. She wants to set out and stay with Naomi and return to the promised land. She has awareness that God is real and that God is in control. She likely experienced that living with Naomi. She loves Naomi, and living with her husband in a household that followed God, certainly to some extent. We don't know how much. And that is enough to get her to come back and make the journey from Moab into the promised land, looking for bread. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it? It's there. We sometimes have trouble with the fact that people struggle and that people are lost, and people, even Christians, are in a land of compromise. But Jesus does his best work as Redeemer with the compromised, with the lost, with the totally depraved. You need to be lost, you need to be in pain, you need to require redemption in order for there to be redemption. That's what he holds up and testifies, that he is Redeemer. He took this lost, hurting, messed up, compromising soul and made them whole and brought them to fellowship with him. Verse 19 says, now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. I find this kind of amusing, and I'm not laughing at her pain or amused by her pain, but look at what they have done. God brought the Israelites out of Egypt miraculously. Parted the Red Sea, did all he does in the Exodus, and then says, go in and I'll go before you and drive your enemies out. He does that. The Israelites half-heartedly follow him. They wholeheartedly for a little while, but then they peter out. They lose their excitement, and they start compromising. And that's what starts the problem. They start laying with foreign women and drinking and carousing and worshiping false gods on the high places. And so the Israelites start the problem. God sends warnings. He calls them back to him, and they ignore him, so that he then allows the judgment to come in. And Naomi and her husband, rather than even be the rest of the nation, the cycles with the Book of Judges involves when those judgments come, the nation as a whole turns back to him. God sends the judge to lead them, and they fight off the Philistines, or they turn back to God. Elimelech and Naomi don't even do that. They make the decision to not trust God. They say, God promised milk and honey. God promised to provide for us. That's not enough. We're going to leave and go to Moab. That's their decision. They then leave, disobey the direction of God to stay in the promised land. Say, I'm out of here. God's not going to provide for us. Go in the far country and then stay for at least 10 years. Then the family, we assume that Naomi approved of it, gets married to foreign women, which they're not supposed to do. So not only do they leave, but when hardship comes there, they reinforce their rebellion and stay. Each step is a decision that they make independent of what God tells them. It's a decision of rebellion, and they make it. Naomi, when she comes back, says, this is God's fault. God has dealt bitterly with me, and completely ignores the fact that it's been her decision at every step. I find it amusing because it's the tendency in all of us. We want to do this. We want to blame God for our decisions. When all the way back to the Garden of Eden, immediately after the fall, when Eve eats and then gives it to Adam, and Adam eats. And we know from the New Testament that Adam knows that it's wrong. He knows it's rebellion, and he does it anyway. It's the first declaration of rebellion against God. God comes into the garden, and what does Adam say? The woman, her over here, that you gave me, made me do this. So it's not my fault. I know there's going to be consequences, but it's not my fault. It's Eve's fault, and your fault, God. God, you've dealt bitterly with me. Why did you do this to me? We don't want to take the responsibility for our own decisions. And if anything, we will see how true it is what Naomi says. First, they call me Mara, bitterness. Her name had been pleasing, and now it's bitterness, not because of what God does for her, but what sin does to her. Sin takes her out of the promised land. Sin robs her of a husband. Sin robs her of her children, her 2 sons. And then sin turns one of the 2 daughters-in-law back to a life of idolatry and pagan worship. She's lost everything because of sin. And yes, that makes her bitter. And the bitterness reinforces it and causes even the good things like God's mercy and God's call back to the promised land to turn into bitterness, to turn into something that destroys Orpah and is just twisting her own soul. It's really sad to look at. Naomi at this point has a daughter-in-law who loves her. She has life. She's back in the promised land. She has a God who loves her. And there's so much to be thankful for, even in the world where there is such loss. But because she's refusing to turn back to God. It's just bitterness. It's ashes. God is going to turn it into beauty, but she is trying to just sit and dwell in her own ashes, in her own bitterness. And then the second thing that she has correctly identified, but she probably doesn't even realize, is when she says, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. So she means it one way, the Lord uses it, or means it another. She means it that she had so much in her hands. She had children. She had a husband. And that is terrible to lose. And she thinks that is fullness. But she's also part of the family that leaves the promised land, that turns away from God and sets out in self-sufficiency for compromise. She and Elimelech are filled with rebellion. They're filled with distrust. They're filled with lack of faith. They're filled with just self. So when they come back, when she comes back, she's focusing on the fact that she's empty, that she's lost her husband and her son, which is terrible. But she's also empty in the fact that all of that is gone. Her time of rebellion is gone, her time turning away from God, and her time of self-sufficiency is over. It's not a bad thing to be crushed by the world. I know it's a bold statement, but at that moment, when we stop struggling and stop fighting and stop trying to follow our own plans and do our own thing, that is when God comes in and can really use us. God is always there speaking to us. He has been speaking to her. He has called her back into the promised land to be a child of God. But she can't hear it while she's in Moab, seeking compromise, while she's comfortable with her decisions, while her sons are getting married and she's got hopes of grandchildren. This is kind of the beginning of the end here, because the decision to go into Moab is over. The consequences are being felt. The bitterness has bloomed and taking root in Naomi. And they've come back to Bethlehem, the house of bread, ready to be fed. This is where the picture of Jesus in the story comes in Boaz, and it really gets good. It gets really pointing forward to the gospel of Jesus. So the fact that it is painful now, kind of like in life, the painful seasons usually are the openings for God to do something amazing, for God to really show you his power and his redemption and his might and his mercy and his love. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray, and we've all gotten ourselves into situations where we desperately need his redemption. We don't want to judge Naomi and say, she's just bad. She's just a person. She's just a person who did what was right in her own eyes. And now God has brought her back. And in the next chapters we're going to see, she and Ruth, particularly Ruth, who's a picture of the Gentiles who are coming to, who were not originally called, but they're coming to the Lord and are going to, with just a strong heart and good intentions and just a hearing God's call from the far off land, are going to experience clearly his redemption. It's a wonderful picture that's coming up, but we need to fall, we need to be crushed, we need to lose all in order to really experience the redemption of Jesus. When born again is what we're called, the new life in Jesus. It sounds great, but it also means that the old life, the old me, has got to die, has got to go away and be left behind. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this second part, and we'll stay tuned for part 3 as we continue through the Book of Ruth.